Imagine this. You are about to walk over a high suspension bridge. You know that the engineering is very good. Thousands of people walk over the bridge every day. But as you step out above the water, your palms start to get sweaty, your heart races, and suddenly you're wondering if a gust of wind might blow you off the side or if the railing will break if you lean on it. Perhaps a freak earthquake is about to hit and the whole bridge will collapse in seconds. You could, of course, turn back, but what if people laugh at you? What if you trip? The only thing your body seems to know is that you aren't safe, despite all your higher logic stating that you are safe. Now, those aren't just random nerves, they are a biological survival mechanism dating back millions of years. Fear was our ever-present companion and has been hardwired into our brains to keep us safe from harm. Whether you are standing in front of a crowd, facing a risky career move, or deciding whether to speak your mind in a tough conversation, that anxiety has been placed there to help save your life. But here lies the problem. Whilst fear was incredibly useful for our caveman ancestors, facing actual life or death situations in the modern world is less about running from lions and more about navigating complex social, emotional, and personal challenges. Yet fear will still operate in much the same way. It can sometimes be a bit like using a fire alarm to alert you to a burnt piece of toast. The reaction is disproportionate to the actual danger. In this episode, we're going to be exploring the neuroscience behind fear. What's going on in the brain when you feel it? How does this impact our thoughts and behaviors? And then we're going to have a bit of a tour of the 4 main fears in life that hold us back, the impact of trauma in changing our brain circuitry. And then I want to look at some more extreme cases in the same way that anybody can learn about productivity advice by looking at someone with ADHD. I want to look at generalized anxiety disorder and strategies for how to deal with fear that can help all of us. Also look into borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and lastly ADHD, which you might be surprised to learn has quite a lot of fear components within it. The lessons we will cover will not only be useful for individuals who specifically suffer from these problems. You don't need to have borderline disorder to have any fear of abandonment, and we all have an ego we want to protect without actually being narcissists. So learning strategies that these individuals can follow to help with specific flavors of their own fears and anxiety can help us all understand some of the science behind the emotions of fear and help us master our own minds. So, hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast with me, Sam Webster Harris. As always, diving into the science of self-improvement and the philosophy of living a life well lived, which does mean learning about our fears and how to confront them. So there's a lot coming up, so please stay tuned for after the break.
Esse podcast é apresentado por Nubank Ultravioleta. Em uma pesquisa feita por Nubank Ultravioleta e Ipsos, constatou-se que os brasileiros têm só 1/4 de tempo livre ao longo dos 58 anos da vida adulta. Sabe o que isso quer dizer? Que passamos muito mais da metade do nosso tempo ocupados com trabalho, tarefas de casa, dormindo e até no trânsito. E aí fica a pergunta: será que estamos usando o nosso tempo da melhor maneira? Para saber mais sobre o resultado completo da pesquisa, acesse o blog de Nubank Ultravioleta.
To understand why fear holds us back, we first need to explore what happens when fear kicks in. It's not just a mental state. Fear is a full body experience powered by very old neural circuits, and the process starts deep within the brain, particularly in a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala or Amygdala, depending on what you were taught. Don't hate me if I always use amygdala, but it's the one I'm going with. And you can think of it as your internal security guard in some way. Its job is to scan your environment for threats, assess potential danger, and hit the panic button before you have even consciously realized there is something to be afraid of. And we'll go through a quick tour of the brain regions that collaborate to produce the overwhelming sense of dread you might feel when you face fear, or help regulate the initial triggers to keep us in check. As I've said, we start with the amygdala that processes information within milliseconds to start triggering the fight or flight response, our survival mechanism to get our body ready to confront danger or run from it. Because it's so fast, this is why you might do something like scream before realizing that the snake in the grass in front of you is actually a stick. Then we have the hippocampus, which sits right next to the amygdala. It will help you remember whether that snake-like object is dangerous or harmless based on your past experiences. Of course, our fear responses could be greatly amplified if you had in the past been bitten by a snake before. And it's important to realize that without the hippocampus helping out, you'd be afraid of basically anything remotely similar to a snake every single time. The context that it provides is essential for us to not being afraid of almost everything. Then you have the prefrontal cortex, which is the rational part of our brain that's more associated with conscious awareness. It's meant to be the CEO of our thoughts and responsible for decision-making. It should help us balance the amygdala's emotional responses and tell you that the stick is not a real snake, it's just a stick, and can really help us override the amygdala's responses when necessary. But you should remember that the amygdala generally has a head start, which is why maybe if you miss the last step and you begin to trip and you pretty much instantly land on your feet, in that split second, your body is already starting to pump with cortisol because that momentary loss of balance has already got you ready for a giant fall or something scary, even though by the time you're consciously aware of it, you've already landed on your feet. Lastly, we have the hypothalamus, which is a bit of a hormonal command center. When the amygdala raises the alarm, it sends a message to our hypothalamus, which instantly triggers the release of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, and that will get your heart rate increasing, your breathing will go faster, blood will start pumping to your muscles, preparing for action, and it really drives a lot of the physical side of fear. So that's the physical bits in our brain side of things covered. Then we have neuroception, which we've been learning about lately already, which is the body's scanning system based on all our sensory inputs. And neuroception is a term coined by, of course, Dr. Stephen Porges, who was on the show a month ago. It operates at a completely subconscious level, always scanning our environment for safety or threats and recognizing patterns that we wouldn't even recognize at a conscious level to alert us to potential danger. So how does all this neural dance manifest in our body? Well, once the amygdala and hypothalamus are in full swing, that activates our sympathetic nervous system, which leads us into the whole fight and flight situations. Our body is filling with cortisol, keep us in heightened alertness. As I mentioned earlier, we're getting into fight or flight with the heart beating faster, blood pumping to muscles, even our pupils dilating to take in more information. But sometimes we also have the potential freeze response, which is another survival strategy because if you're immobile, you're less likely to be noticed by a predator. And even in the modern day, whether facing a bully or an issue with the law, if fighting or running away is only going to lead you to more problems and more pain, it can often be better to lay down and do nothing and hope that the problem you face doesn't go too badly for you. Now, fear still has a lot of useful things in the modern day. It does stop us from falling off the sides of bridges or losing our jobs due to outrageous behavior. But modern life can have its own way of keeping us in a near constant state of stress. And this chronic fear can lead to overactivity in the amygdala, meaning that we're permanently more sensitive to any potential threat and very easily triggered. Over time, this can even lead to the hippocampus shrinking due to the prolonged exposure of cortisol, which then makes it even harder for us to differentiate between real threats and false alarms. And that's why people with chronic anxiety might find themselves panicking in a relatively harmless situation. So in short, fear is essential for survival, but in the modern world, it can become maladaptive. And if our fear circuitry is overreactive, it can really hold us back from taking normal and necessary risks to grow and thrive, as you might do if you have a growth mindset. So let's look a little bit into the philosophy of fear. At a very fundamental level, all of our emotions are due to the duality of either fear or desire. They're a bit of a yin and yang couple. All of our actions can be explained with the two elements of fear and desire at the same time. A soup that is too hot might burn you. A soup that is too cold might be unhealthy. We desire a soup just at the right temperature as much for the delight of the good taste as it is for the fear of the wrong temperature. Maybe you don't care about soup, but you probably desire to give a good speech as much as you fear giving a bad speech. You might desire approaching an attractive person as much as you fear them rejecting you or looking silly, and so on. Now, obviously, fear isn't just about saber-toothed tigers and dark alleyways. It's also about the quiet moments when we hesitate. Perhaps we stall or give up. Fear keeps us stuck, not always because of real danger, but because of perceived threats to our sense of self, our ambitions, or our relationships. We can explain all of our fears in life from 4 core fears that we all have in different amounts in different areas, and pretty much any combination will hold us back in some way in life. We have the fear of failure, which might result in loss of status or self-worth or safety. There's the fear of uncertainty, where ambiguity and unpredictability keeps us clinging to the familiar. Then there's fear of ridicule, where we might potentially lose our acceptance, admiration, or love from others and become an outsider. And then, surprisingly, there is fear of success, because success might come with responsibilities, pressures with maintaining that success. Being a leader of a tribe means you are responsible for the safety of others, and you might face challenges to your leadership. Most success comes with responsibilities, which is one step further away from the dreamlike state of being in the womb where all our needs were looked after without us having to think about them. These 4 fears can genuinely explain most of our other fears. Let's say someone has a fear of intimacy. Within that, there's the fear of failure and being rejected. Our fear of uncertainty means that we don't know if this person will really like the real us if we do become closer, or if that person will truly be a safe person for us. Then there's fear of ridicule for admitting our inner desires and perhaps being deemed a loser by showing who we really are. And then lastly, of course, the fear of success, where we have to be a dependable partner to take on responsibilities for someone else. And we could go through much the same process for the fear of public speaking, explained by those 4 fears. Of course, any growth mindset aficionados amongst you will recognize that overcoming these 4 fears is the hallmark of having a growth mindset. Comfort with failure and uncertainty, being able to deal with potential ridicule or our potential success, that's all essential for adaptability and growth. And much as I would love to dive into all of this right now, I've decided to do a much deeper dive into these 4 fears in the next episode, as they are so key to understanding any mindset, not just fixed and growth mindset, but also scarcity and abundance, closed or open mindset, etc. And I figured I would keep this episode more focused on the neuroscience of fear, as I was in danger already of turning this into a book, and my scripts do sometimes grow legs. And before this becomes too messy, there will be another episode that is fundamentally linked to this one, but is worthy of being a separate thing. Instead, I want to talk about how our fear circuitry becomes amplified through trauma. 70% of people do experience some trauma in their lives, whether an accident like a car crash or neglect and abuse by family, bullying at school, abuse even by a partner. Then there's things like natural disasters or violence. The list is quite long. Initially, the word trauma sounds like something that should be rare, but we find that it touches most of us in at least a small way, and for many of us, it can actually be a major part of our lives. Trauma has a lasting impact on how we see the world and our fears. Since I nearly died kiteboarding when I snapped my femur, I am still a very active person and I do plenty of stupid things. But I am constantly very aware that I could die. 6 weeks ago, I was surfing and I was hit in the face by my surfboard, and it really hurt. And I was just lying in the water with this overwhelming sinking feeling of dread. I was like, wow, I could really die. There's a lot of water around. My skull is so breakable. Maybe I've broken something and I haven't realized it yet. Oh, I'm near some rock. I could drown. And anyway, I moseyed around for half an hour pretending to surf and not surfing. And once the lesson was over, I genuinely haven't gone surfing since. So yes, I should probably buy a helmet and go easy on myself, because surfing can be a lovely thing when done right. But I found it very interesting for myself. That was a whole set of fears that would have never affected me or gone through my brain in the slightest 10 years ago. But now, whenever I have a close call with a car or I suffer a big fall or impact, especially if I'm in water where I was when I snapped my femur, it does really trigger me, and it does give me this overwhelming feeling of fear and shame that I'm being so stupid to be risking my life. So what is going on with trauma? Well, changes in our brain structure and function. It leads to a hyperactive amygdala, meaning the brain is more likely to perceive the situations around us as threatening, leading to heightened fear responses, emotional reactivity, and anxiety. Amazingly, trauma can reduce the size and functioning of our hippocampus, the brain region involved in the memory and context processing. And this smaller hippocampus can impair our ability to place fear responses in the correct context. That impairment can cause exaggerated fear responses to non-threatening stimuli, and for example, that would mean seeing all sticks as snakes. And finally, in the prefrontal cortex, trauma can really impair our ability to regulate emotion and inhibit the amygdala's fear responses. Having this final screen for rationality left unchecked can lead to a lot of difficulties in managing our emotions and a tendency to react very impulsively to perceived threats. And it is surprising to realize how much physical change there is inside our brains that will adapt us towards being more fearful. Of course, all of these changes are much more pronounced if we experience trauma early in life, or especially from our family and later at school or over prolonged periods. This will also impact on our neuroception and sensitivity to perceived threats, potentially leading us to chronic hypervigilance. And essentially, this all means that trauma can condition the brain to respond much more frequently with a fight, flight, or freeze reaction, even in situations where responses are completely unnecessary. For example, this conditioning can result in an automatic reaction to perceptions of threats, which actually leads us to creating a real version of the threat that we were scared of in the first place, further establishing the pathway that we should be threatened. For example, someone might misperceive a safe person as a threat or untrustable, and then lash out at them. And doing this consistently can lead to the point where that safe person is no longer someone that they can rely on, which confirms their initial fear that they couldn't rely on them and creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of always being fearful of others. Another aspect from trauma is, of course, PTSD, which is characterized by persistent hyperarousal and re-experiencing of traumatic events. Again, this is caused by an overactive amygdala and a less effective prefrontal cortex, resulting in persistent levels of fear and anxiety. The hippocampus might also have an impaired ability to contextualize memories, which can result in things like flashbacks and intrusive thoughts, where traumatic memories are experienced as if they are happening in the present. And this attribution can trigger very intense fear responses and reactivity, even in the absence of immediate danger. Many of us likely have at least some specific fears in individual situations, and some of us might suffer from this manifesting into a more general anxiety disorder, or lead to things like attachment style issues. And as I said, if experienced earlier on, it can lead to personality disorders such as borderline, narcissism, and can even contribute to ADHD, which we are going to talk about. It does turn out that nearly all personality disorders have a link to trauma. Interestingly, there's also at least some genetic component that makes it more likely for the brain's fear circuitry, particularly the amygdala and prefrontal cortex and their connectivity, to be slightly dysregulated, which can lead to slightly heightened emotional reactivity. But trauma can greatly exacerbate these issues by altering the brain structure and functions, leading to these persistent fear responses and increased sensitivity to perceiving threats all around us. And for anyone wanting to build a growth mindset, it is essential to build empathy and understanding of the fear mechanisms in those all around us, as well as for yourself. Because how can you get comfortable with fear of failure and uncertainty if you ignore the role of fear in your life? Fear doesn't just affect our day-to-day anxieties and hesitations. It will genuinely dictate our outcomes in life, such as academic, sports, and business success, and of course, our relationships. Whether we have fears based from trauma or not, many of us still don't like spiders, heights, flying, or public speaking without any link to specific trauma. So let's look into some of the science behind what's going on and how to deal with it. And I wanted to look at some specific disorders related to elevated fears in some ways and the lessons that we could draw for all of us. As I mentioned, we're going to look at general anxiety disorder, borderline and narcissistic personality disorders. Both have some intense emotional reactions that are deep-rooted in fears, although they manifest quite differently between both of them. And lastly, ADHD, which has a huge and very poorly understood link to anxiety and fear. We're going to have a quick break and then we will be back to discuss all of that and more. Richard Feynman is famous for saying that it is essential to understand the difference between knowing the name of a thing and truly knowing the thing. The fundamental problem is that we stop questioning. Well, my sponsor today is the podcast Constant Wonder, who want to help you build back the questioning habit and look at the world around you with a sense of curious and constant wonder. I recently enjoyed an episode on their show about the minds of bees and the fact that each neuron in the brain of a bee has over 600 connections to other neurons, and that they can count using only 4 neurons, and besides their 2 main eyes, they have 3 eyes in the middle of their forehead, which is quite a bonkers arrangement, and certainly has made me look at bees in a new way. If you like to build some sense of wonder into your life with topics such as how to cool the earth using the sun, or how to reforest the desert, or how humans can learn to use echolocation to navigate themselves, well, you're in luck. You can tune into the podcast Constant Wonder wherever you get your podcasts. Firstly, let's look at general anxiety. For individuals diagnosed with anxiety, fear isn't just an occasional visitor, it's a constant presence. Anxiety disorders affect millions of people worldwide, and 30% of adults will suffer from anxiety at some point in their life. It tends to involve excessive fear responses that interfere with all parts of our daily life. And as you've probably learned already from the episode so far, at the center of anxiety's grip on someone is, of course, the amygdala, the brain's fear center. In individuals with anxiety, the amygdala is often very overactive, meaning it perceives threats in situations that are actually safe. Because the amygdala is wired to react so quickly before the rational brain has time to step in, it can result in a constant state of alertness, making everyday situations appear as looming threats. It's like having an alarm system on your home that you just can't ever turn off, even when you're trying to use the house. Furthermore, the prefrontal cortex can become impaired, and instead of regulating the amygdala and managing fear, it can have trouble calming our fear responses. That's why people who know that their fear is irrational can still struggle to control it. Then there's the hypothalamus, which we know kicks off the hormonal stress responses with cortisol and adrenaline. For people with anxiety, cortisol can be released a lot more often, keeping the body in a state of heightened alertness, leading to long-term physical and mental health issues. And to look at an example in real life, imagining someone with social anxiety walking into a crowded room, their amygdala will immediately start signaling danger in the brain, even though they might logically know the room isn't a threat, but their heart will start racing, their breathing will quicken, and they'll have an overwhelming urge to run away. They really might understand that they aren't in physical danger, but their brain's fear system convinces them otherwise. That makes the experience of simply interacting with others very overwhelming. For more generalized anxiety, the fear might not be tied to specific situations, but manifests as a persistent worry about everyday events. What if something goes wrong at work? What if I forget to lock the door? And the brain reacts almost constantly, as if these minor uncertainties are life-threatening, and that leads to constant and draining hypervigilance. But there is something you can do about it. In the same way that life events, such as trauma, can lead to increased activity in the amygdala, reduce the size of our hypothalamus, and reduce the effectivity of our prefrontal cortex, we can use different practices within our lives to do the complete opposite and reduce the activity of the amygdala, increase the rational level of thought that comes from our prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, and reduce the amount of cortisol being produced by our hypothalamus. The ways for someone to manage anxiety are useful for all of us, whether we have a few specific quirky fears, or we simply wish to reduce our baseline levels of fear every day. One of the most widely known and accepted forms of therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very effective for treating anxiety. It helps retrain the brain by identifying irrational thought patterns and replacing them with more balanced thinking. Over time, CBT can strengthen the prefrontal cortex, and improve its ability to regulate the amygdala's fear response. So definitely something worth considering if you do feel like a specific fear impacts your life and you want to overcome it. Then more widely, there are things like mindfulness and meditation, which is probably not very surprising, but mindfulness practices will reduce the brain's reactivity to fear by keeping an individual focused on the present moment rather than their future worries. Regular meditation has genuinely been shown to dramatically decrease the activity of the amygdala and improve regulation from the prefrontal cortex. So I know we hear about the benefits of meditation and mindfulness all the time, but examples like this are a really good reason to consider trying it, even though I know it's not easy for many of us to take on and turn into a habit. However, we have some other options. Next, we have exercise. Physical activity really helps reduce our cortisol levels, and that reduces the overall stress responses we experience. Exercise also increases the production of endorphins, which are natural mood stabilizers, and it promotes brain health in general, which is a huge help in balancing the emotional circuitry inside our brains. So physical exercise is actually a massive win for us on every level. Furthermore, exercise just generally relieves stress in the moment by getting you outside and moving your body. And it's useful to know that if you struggle to meditate, then things like yoga can be a lighter version of meditation that can be a very calming, mindful activity that centers you in the moment. Another great option to consider is actually taking up a martial art, which can really help calm us through our ability to channel stress and be very in the present. So honestly, it is hard to overstate how good exercise is for us. Then another strategy for dealing with general anxiety is, of course, exposure therapy. That involves slowly, safely confronting our fears that might trigger some anxieties. For instance, someone with social anxiety might start by attending small social gatherings, progressively working their way up to larger events. And this method helps us rewire the brain and massage new ways of acting and thinking into us, teaching the amygdala that these scary situations aren't dangerous and help our logic systems return to normal function. And these are much easier to do with the help of someone else. So even if you don't want to go to therapy, but you do have a specific fear, you might want to talk to them about setting some goals and having some help in working your way up to them. Next, we're going to discuss borderline personality disorder, which is often described as living with emotional volatility. It can be like having a brain that's on constant high alert, ready to go into crisis mode over very small triggers. And it might appear on the outside very similar to general anxiety, but borderline individuals have a slightly binary approach to things, where they'll feel that they're completely terrible or completely amazing. Whatever emotion they're experiencing, they experience it very intensely. Also, when it comes to their fears, they're often more specific and in relation to specific traumas that they suffered when they were young, and they probably won't have a fear of going outside, for example. Although, that said, if someone with borderline does have a phobia of anything like heights or mice, they might appear more scared than someone with a similar phobia. As someone with borderline, their emotions are just so strong and intense. At the heart of their reactivity is fear, particularly the fear of abandonment and rejection and potential emotional pain. These are fears that all of us deal with, they're just more amplified with someone with borderline. They can live with an almost constant undercurrent of anxiety driven by the fear that those closest to them will leave. Now, in terms of the neuroscience behind it, you will definitely be noticing a pattern by now. They have a hyperactive amygdala, leading to a much bigger response to emotional stimuli, especially in this case, if they perceive rejection or criticism. The amygdala's overreaction can make it feel like very small emotional threats are catastrophic and trigger very overwhelming levels of fear. Their prefrontal cortex, which should be there to regulate emotions and control impulsive behaviours, doesn't seem to work as effectively, leaving their amygdala completely unchecked. So it's very difficult for someone with BPD to calm themselves down after they've perceived a threat. It's like a fire alarm going off at school and the fire warden has lost the keys and can't ever get to the alarm to physically turn it off. The controlling higher thought that can manage their responses is simply not as effective. It's also been shown that there's a very weak connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex in people with borderline personality disorder. And this weaker connectivity can make it a huge struggle to regulate their emotions in real time, which creates a loop of emotional outbursts, leading to impulsive and destructive behavior. Look at a real life example. Let's say a BPD person had been made to feel stupid or uncoordinated when they were young. Well, he might interpret someone wishing him a safe drive home as a deeply threatening statement. He might suspect that the individual has judged him and is mocking him for his inability to drive and his wishing him safety in his drive home as an insult disguised as a compliment. The well-wisher, of course, might find it very hard to understand why the BPD person seems to have such a strangely negative distortion on reality to perceive his nice, unassuming comment as such a deeply personal threat. And of course, this is coming from the heavily overactive amygdala seeing every stick as a threatening snake. A more general example that all of us might suffer in some way is a BPD person might interpret a delayed text from a friend or partner as a sign that they're being abandoned, which could trigger intense feelings of fear and rejection. This fear might even lead them to lash out emotionally, trying to test their friend's loyalty, which can, ironically, push the person further away and reinforce the fear that they were originally trying to avoid. Because someone with BPD's emotions are so heightened and their safety is so fragile, it has been described as one of the hardest disorders to live with. But there are things that they can do, starting with all the same practices that you can do to take on general anxiety, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness practice, regular exercise, and putting yourself through deliberate exposure to triggering situations whilst coupled with some support. But there are some other things that you can do to further help. It can be useful for them to look into psychoanalysis to understand themselves better, which I think is something that isn't a bad idea for anyone to do. Ruffling around inside your head, understanding yourself better and some of your fears and your past history and trauma can really help equip you with the tools to become more self-aware and work on your problems. And then there's a very specific therapy for just borderline sufferers called dialectical behavior therapy that I probably wouldn't recommend to the average person. It's specifically designed for managing very intense emotions and to reduce your impulsive behaviors. It teaches key skills in emotion regulation and distress tolerance, helping someone with BPD to navigate fear-driven reactions. Yes, it does sound like it could be useful to anyone, but I'd say it probably is a bit too much for the average person. It might actually cause you to start diagnosing fears around you that you don't have. Kind of like trying to clean your dishes with a fire hose could result in a messier kitchen. And that analogy perhaps is a bit too strong, but you get my point that it's a tool for severe levels of emotional dysregulation. But if you do have BPD or if you know someone with it, really worth investigating. Next, we have Narcissistic Personality Disorder, or NPD. Whilst NPD on the surface might seem to be the opposite of fear, narcissists often seem to be overly confident. Fear, however, is actually a driving force behind a lot of their behaviours. The fear of inadequacy, vulnerability, and humiliation plays a huge role in NPD. Importantly, it manifests very differently to borderline personality disorder. Narcissists will live in constant fear that their carefully constructed self-image could be shattered by criticism or failure. And that's why we talk about them having a fragile ego. When we look into the neuroscience of their brains, it does have a lot of similarities to how we develop anxiety through trauma, but it does have some important differences. Again, the amygdala, a key role here, but in this case, it's mostly triggered by threats to self-esteem. When a narcissist experiences criticism, even if it's minor, their amygdala will become very hyperactive, triggering defensive or aggressive behaviors. They'll react to these ego threats as if they were physical threats, because in their mind, being seen as flawed is completely intolerable. Studies also suggest that people with NPD do have less activation in brain regions associated with empathy. Now, specifically, that means the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior insula, if that means anything to you. This resulting reduction in empathy makes it much harder for narcissists to connect with others emotionally, which is why they might react with hostility or indifference when they feel their ego is under attack. Again, they have issues with their prefrontal cortex, making it harder for them to regulate their emotions. So what we see at the core of NPD is a very fragile self-esteem. On the outside, narcissists often project confidence, but the exterior masks the deep-seated fears of inadequacy, and they'll constantly seek validation and external affirmation, often coined narcissistic supply. But the issue is this reliance on others leaves them vulnerable to fear when the validation is threatened. And you could imagine a high-level executive with narcissism who could react angrily when a team provides constructive feedback. Rather than accepting the criticism as an opportunity to improve, she might perceive it as an attack on her competence. Her fear of being exposed as less than perfect could drive her to retaliate, potentially sabotaging her own relationships at work. Now, whether you have narcissism or not, we all have egos that could be dampened a little bit in a lot of situations, and that would genuinely help us have less fear in our lives. Of course, to help with that, you should never neglect a good amount of exercise, potentially a meditation practice, and exposure to the sorts of things that you might be scared of. We've already mentioned CBT, but in the case of looking at ego issues, this can be really helpful to reshape our thought patterns without resorting to defensiveness and aggression. I think it's genuinely useful for most people at some point in their life to look into why they sometimes become defensive on some things, to recognize their fears of vulnerability within them, and begin to challenge some of our, even if we don't quite have the levels of desire to appear as perfect as a narcissist. The big conundrum, of course, for narcissists is that they have such a strong reaction of denial that they are unlikely to believe they are a narcissist or that they need help. Whereas someone who suffers from borderline might be more likely to go to therapy and respond to it because they're more likely to accept their situation, narcissists, however, can find it incredibly hard to accept. However, if they do, it can be very useful for them to build some self-awareness practices, and this can help them recognize when their fear of inadequacy is driving their actions. Self-awareness is a benefit to all of us, as ultimately we can still learn to identify some of our triggers even if they're not as severe, and practice the art of balancing our reactions to criticism and any curveballs that life throws at us. Finally, for the narcissist, they really need to work on developing their empathy, which again is something we can all do. Empathy training and mindfulness practices can really help anyone. And if you are looking to level up in life, I would genuinely consider investigating how you could build more empathy into your life. The funny illusion with empathy is that we can see all the ways that people don't empathize with us and notice the lack of empathy in the rest of the world, but we can't ever see the moments where we aren't empathetic because we can't see what we don't think. We can only think the thoughts that we feel for others without all the ones that we miss, so we'll never see how unempathetic we are. And the only way to build that is by doing some training and things like therapy to help us become aware of ourselves. Okay, finally we have ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which is often seen as a challenge of focus and organization. But beneath these symptoms lies a significant factor of fear. We're pausing for a quick break and then we'll be jumping right back into it. For individuals with ADHD, their inability to structure tasks or organize thoughts can create a constant fear of the unknown. When you're not sure what's coming next or how to approach a task, the uncertainty can spiral into avoidance, stress, and procrastination. But this fear-driven struggle with productivity doesn't only affect those with ADHD. Anyone can feel overwhelmed by unstructured tasks or uncertain outcomes, and that can lead to hesitation and delays in completing our work. From a circuitry standpoint, the Pre-Frontal Cortex, which is responsible for planning and organization, often functions less efficiently in people with ADHD, and that can make it very difficult for them to break tasks into manageable steps, which leads them to feeling overwhelming fear because they're only confronted with large, complex tasks. Their amygdala, which handles fear responses, can also be oversensitive, and some stressful tasks that might seem manageable to others can trigger intense feelings of fear, leading to further procrastination and avoidance. Another fear that people with ADHD might have is a fear of not being up to date and aware of everything. They might want to check news, email, crypto prices, social media, etc., at the cost of the things that they should be doing. Constantly checking stuff can provide a much faster feeling of safety than approaching some unstructured, unplanned task where you don't know where to start. This disorganization and lack of clarity really heightens anxiety. Because they quickly want to jump into the whole thing without clear plans, that makes all their tasks very intimidating, leading to a fear of the unknown, and of course causes a cycle of avoidance, further delaying any progress and increasing stress. Of course, even people without ADHD can face similar fears when they lack some structure in their life. And in general, uncertainty leads to paralysis. I can't stress enough how much ambiguity of not knowing how to start a task or what an outcome can be will make people hesitate. A student with ADHD might delay starting a long-term project, unsure of how to break it into steps. Similarly, someone without ADHD might still procrastinate when faced with an unclear project. And so to help, doing anything that increases our prefrontal cortex functioning and reduces the amygdala firing is a huge benefit. So as we've discussed, exercise, meditation, exposure therapy, CBT, etc., all very helpful to anyone. But some more specific strategies for someone overcoming their fears in ADHD and productivity is perhaps the obvious thing of slowing down and making some better plans, setting clear goals and breaking them up. When you break large tasks into smaller ones, you can create actionable steps, and that might only take 5 minutes, but it can make the rest of your day 10 times easier. Smaller, obvious tasks reduces uncertainty and fear, increases a sense of momentum, and for people with ADHD, using external tools like planners, mind mapping, or apps can provide the structure needed to tackle tasks confidently. And you can even buy ADHD planners these days. Another common method is using timers and time blocks. Techniques like the Pomodoro method help anyone to focus on doing short outbursts of work, which alleviates the fear of long, unstructured tasks. It really helps create order and reduces the fear of endless to-dos. I often feel like I can't start a task unless I have 2 hours for it, because it isn't planned yet and I don't know what I even need to do. But I'll nearly always find that I'll waste the entire 2 hours, realize that I've done nothing, and then in the final 10 minutes, actually start doing it and realize that I only need half an hour to do it anyway. So yes, I do have ADHD, by the way, and one thing I've started to do is ban myself from a lot of the easy behaviors that I use for procrastination, like messaging on my podcaster forum, unless I've done just 10 minutes of real work on my podcast first, because just getting started is such a hurdle for someone that's bad at planning and resists diving into big tasks. But as soon as you have some momentum, it's so easy to keep moving forwards. I've also done things like block all the sites that I go to the most on my laptop so that I can only access them at certain times in the evening. I also don't have social media on my phone and only one email account on there, which is just for logging into stuff. And none of the emails that I ever reply to are on my phone. Another great tool I've discovered lately is called FocusMate, and I would recommend this to all humans. It allows you to decide a time when you want to do some work and you book in a meeting on it, and it will pair you with some random person on the internet, and you'll have a Google meeting together and you both log in at the start time. You just say the task you're working on and then you start working for the rest of the hour. And it's so dumb and so simple, but it's so good because I can make all the plans in the world to do things at a certain time and just never do them. But the act of just having someone there means like, oh, I should really be doing my writing now. And so I'll just start. Whereas I could easily put off the task I'm supposed to do all day long without that accountability. So FocusMate is a wonderful tool. Otherwise, I am actually in therapy for ADHD and mainly exploring CBT for it at the moment. I'm going to be honest, we just looked at a task that I've been putting off for 2 months, and my therapist made me create a mind map of my blockers. It took 5 minutes. I instantly saw a bunch of issues with my approaches, and it was so frustrating to realize that I just didn't have a good plan and had a lot of messy notes around my systems. And once I'd done it, it was so easy to get the task done. And all it took was 5 minutes of doing a mind map and someone sitting there and making me do it. And since then, I did a different mind map of all my main blockers I feel I mostly have on a daily basis across both my mornings and afternoons. And I found that most of my issues are in 3 areas. Either unorganized and messy notes with bad planning, which means that my next task is unobvious and feels like a scary big thing and I don't know when it's going to happen. It leads to me doing things like mixing my decision and the action I'm supposed to take in the same task, which is always a bad idea. Another area is just procrastination habits, where when I'm faced with a big task, instead I'll have a default routine of all the different websites or apps I might check first ingrained into my behavior. And that's why I've blocked them all. And finally, I have more like mindset general routine, I would call it. Things like a shutdown ritual at night for my laptop, cleaning my room, a sensible bedtime, doing yoga in the morning, most of which I've been pretty good at lately. But one thing that came out that really surprised me was I have no specific time for my exercise. And I think this is partly because I'm so incredibly reliable at exercising. I would genuinely say I'm like a dog that just has to exercise. Because of that, I don't actually need a plan to do it because I just make it happen. The issue is that if I don't have a plan, I don't know what it is I'm actually going to do or when it will be. That means I can often waste my entire afternoon getting nothing done because I haven't exercised yet, but I'm frustrated that I haven't finished something. And so I'm like, I'm going to finish something before I exercise, but I don't have the headspace to finish the thing. I'm also wondering what exercise it is I'm going to do and when, and it's just a mess. So now, instead, I'm planning out a whole week of which exercises I'm going to do and when, and the timings of them. So it's just a whole set of decisions and brain space that doesn't need to belong in my day-to-day at all and removes all that headspace from my everyday. Going through that mind map didn't take me too long, but has given me so much more awareness of what I do every day and why I'm so bad at getting the things done. So yes, genuinely, a lot of super basic things can help with ADHD, and just having someone with you to keep you accountable and do it. Honestly, 5 minutes of mind mapping before you jump into any task, building that as a habit could genuinely change your life and make you get so much more done, and will help you reduce all the fears of the unknown that you have, identify all your procrastination habits, and really reduce them. So there you go. Fear is such a powerful emotion that is really deeply rooted in our evolutionary history. And when we leave it unchecked, it can really stop us from growing. It can hold us back from new opportunities. It can keep us trapped in harmful patterns. Whether you become paralyzed by the fear of failure, uncertainty, ridicule, or even the fear of success, ultimately we're all struggling with some form of emotional reactivity. And understanding how the fear works in the brain is our first step towards mastering it. We will dive into the 4 main fears that people have in the next episode. And for now, we've learned that fear isn't invincible. We can use strategies like cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, exercise, and exposure to help us retrain our brains, reduce our activity of the amygdala and its grip on our reactions, strengthen the rational part of our brain in the prefrontal cortex to help us make more balanced and thoughtful decisions. So the next time you are feeling fear creeping in, whether that is the fear of being judged, rejected, or maybe failure, well, you can remember that it is your brain just doing its job, but you do have the power to override it. If you do have any further questions on any of these things, you are, of course, welcome to join the premium subscriber feed where you can jump into the Ask Me Anything dashboard, or you can book a call with me for free on the Wednesday afternoons. If anything helps you in the show, then you can do me a huge favor by sharing it with others or giving me a top review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And on that, I hope you stay safe and fearless. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
But when we learn things, it's important to reflect. So I politely invite you to take a pause, rifle through the biggest ideas you just heard. So here's your opportunity to hit pause and have a think. Okay, did you wrestle with some insights? Information doesn't stick when we race from one podcast to the next without using our brain to play with the knowledge. So here's another go at a pause. Alrighty, I'll let you off to continue with your life now. If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
And other than that, please stay curious. Curious. Quote. Smiling for no reason.
Hi, I'm Alexis Ohanian. You may know me as one of the co-founders of Reddit, but more recently, a large part of my identity is being a father to my wonderful daughters. In my podcast, Business Dad, I hope to open the conversation about working parents a bit. You'll get to hear from a wide range of business dads, from Rainn Wilson and Guy Raz to Todd Carmichael and Shane Battier, to find out how they balance being a dad with a successful career. Business Dad is available now, so be sure to listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.